As a culture critic, I am a big fan of identities. It's always exciting for me to see kids who feel alienated to the society they grew up in rebelling against their predicament, and finding each other to form new group identities and add to the diversity in our world. So I am automatically sympathetic to new identities, and want to protect them. When I first became familiar with the issue of non-binary gender identities, something about it seemed dubious to me, but I was still sympathetic. When I made a video criticizing the phenomenon, I did not attack the identities themselves, but merely criticized the attempt to label anyone who doesn't recognize them a bigot. Lately, however, the issue has been thrust into the limelight, so I've decided to take a closer look at it and see why these identities encounter such resistance. I searched for someone to explain non-binary identities to me, and found this series made by Ashley Mardell, titled ABCs of LGBT. It's a very well-made series, in which Ashley and her non-binary friends present their world. I found it to be a very useful introduction.
Most of us know the L stands for lesbian, the G for gay, and many of us have a decently solid idea of what these labels mean. At least to us. So what I would like to cover today are the identities that are less accepted, more unique, mis- or underrepresented, and sometimes hella ambiguous.
The first video is presented by Ashley alone, and it deals with sexual identities.
So let's get the ball rolling with a ton of sexualities that exist between the hetero and homo ends of the orientation spectrum. Note that these are very important to talk about because there is a lot of middle of the spectrum or bi erasure out there, and that's not cool.
So here's my first question, Ashley. Why? Why do you need these labels? The labels that we are familiar with today were created in the late 19th century, when scientists began to classify certain sexual identities that deviated from the norm: homosexuality, pedophilia, necrophilia, and a few more. Whereas previously such behaviors were regarded as a result of corruption by sin, now the idea was that these are individuals that are born with a different nature. Once they were defined as such, LGBT people sought each other out and formed an underground culture, which soon developed its own identity and customs. Of course, that only intensified their image as people of a different nature, and the idea was that they are different not just in their sexual proclivities but in other ways as well. And so society was divided into the straight world and the gay world, with the gays being the persecuted minority. In the last few decades, however, we've begun to realize that there is something wrong with this picture, for a very simple reason. We are not attracted to people because of the form of their genitalia. Rigidly labeling people as either hetero or homosexual by nature makes it seem like sexual attraction revolves around one's sex organs. But in actuality, we are attracted to people for a combination of many traits. I, for instance, am attracted to softness. I like soft skin, soft lips, soft voice, a soft demeanor, and I am repelled by roughness of these things. Obviously, that preference orients me towards women, and that's just one of the many preferences that determine my level of sexual attraction to another human. So far in my life, all the individuals that I found attractive were women, so I am what you would call straight. But there is the possibility that one day I might meet a man who possesses the combination that I will find appealing. In other words, it's not that I've been stamped with the ability to be attracted only to humans who have vaginas. A different sexual orientation is not a matter of having a different nature. It is simply a matter of taste. And that's my problem with you guys. You are introducing something new into our culture, something that is very troubling. You are categorizing people based on their taste. You see, maintaining a tolerant and pluralistic society depends on two things. First, that we acknowledge the difference between individuals. Secondly, that we realize that despite these differences we also have many things in common, and we should treat every individual as part of a human family. We form group identities based on shared interests and shared experiences, and we accept that these things unite us with some people but distinguish us from others, in essential and significant ways. But there are some differences that are not significant that should not divide us, and one of them is difference in taste. We don't consider ourselves as belonging to a different group of people just because you like apples and I prefer oranges. You are trying to divide us by taste as well, and this is a dangerous cultural development that I cannot and will not accept. You seem to think that labeling is nothing but a harmless and innocent game, but it's not. At the time when we strictly divided our world between straight and gay, straight people had a problem admitting it when they felt attraction to members of their own gender, and gay people had a problem admitting it when they felt attractions to people of the opposite gender. They didn't just have a problem admitting it to others, but also to themselves. Once you label yourself in a certain way, it becomes an identity, and admitting such attractions threatens that identity, and causes psychological problems. You'd rather repress those attractions, but by that you are denying yourself what might turn out to be a joyful experience. We've worked so hard to rid ourselves of these labels and remove these psychological inhibitions, and we've come close to creating a society in which the only differences that matter between straight and gay are cultural differences. But now, you are reversing the process and trying to create a society that is more partitioned than ever before. Why would you want to put us back in those straitjackets, and create labels that will restrict us even more? Moving on. Towards the end of the video, Ashley says something quite rattling, which bodes ill for the rest of the series.
Let's backtrack to that buzzword self-identifying. This is the idea that people have power over not only the labels they choose to use when describing themselves, but also what these labels mean. My pansexuality might be different from your pansexuality. My bi might be different from your bi, but we're still both allowed to use these words and our own personal, individual definitions for them. You gotta own the word. The word does not own you.
You do not own language, Ashley. There is no such thing as private language. Language by its nature is public, and you have to use it in the acceptable way or communication between people will be impossible. If you want to introduce a new word or new interpretation to an existing word, you can present it and try to insert it into our language. Once it takes hold, then you can use it in a conversation, not before. What makes you think that you have the right to take something public and use it in any way you want? Ashley then moves on to discuss gender identities. There are so many that she needs several videos to cover the subject.
Schwa, are you ready? Gender identity, biological sex, gender expression, cisgender, MTF, FTM, MTM, FTF, transgender versus transgendered, trans with an asterisk, transsexual, transvestite, cross-dressing, drag, dysphoria, being gender, queer, gender fluid, agender, neutois, gender variant, androgynous, intersex, demigirl, and demiguy. We'll talk about the gender binary and PGPs, and we'll cover identities like third/other gender, bigender, trigender, two-spirit, non-binary, and probably much more.
To explain all of this, Ashley, who personally identifies as cisgender, recruits some of her non-binary friends. The first thing they deal with is...
So Jake, why don't you take it away with our first topic, which is biological sex versus gender identity versus gender expression.
There are many aspects to a person's gender in relation to their body. First of all, you have biological sex. This is normally defined as the genitalia and body that you were born into. This biological sex does not define your gender or how you identify. Gender identity is the way that you identify up here in your head. This can be, again, a whole multitude of things. You have male, you've got female, and then you've got the beautiful world of non-binary. You also have gender expression, which is the way you choose to express your gender.
So, we have three different terms here. In a binary world, there are two biological sexes, i.e. the two different anatomical systems that constitute a reproductive system, two genders that correspond to these sexes, namely male and female, and a various set of gender expressions that define each of the genders, like wearing pants if you're a male and wearing a dress if you're a female. Our non-binary hosts try to convince us that none of these three are binary, and that they are actually disconnected from each other. Let's begin with biological sex.
Biological sex is actually a social construct. Now, this doesn't mean that sex isn't real or that having a base understanding of one's sex isn't important to medical records and stuff like that. Human bodies are way too complicated to be described as entirely male or entirely female. Sex is made up of multiple components, including chromosomes, gonads, genitals, secondary sex characteristics, and hormones. There are very few people that have all of the characteristics that make up the binary sex of male or the binary sex of female. Thus, labeling a body as male or female based solely on outward appearance is assuming a lot about chromosomes, hormones, and internal anatomy. The way that biological sex is usually described is not only non-factual and sexist, but it's also based off of really toxic ideas about gender.
Once again, This shows a fundamental misunderstanding of how language works. You claim that there's a problem with the terms male and female because we can't provide clear definitions of these terms, but there is no such thing as a clear definition of a term. That's true for any term. If you ask me to define an apple, I will not be able to provide you with a definition that will be true to every apple in the world. But if you try to trick me and ask me what is an apple, I will simply counter by asking you to define what and define is, and then you will realize that you cannot provide an all-encompassing definition even to those everyday words. In other words, the fact that a term doesn't have a clear definition doesn't mean that there's something wrong with it. Our language works on a principle known as family resemblance, meaning that things that are grouped together under the same label do not universally share the same traits, but are connected by a series of overlapping similarities. There are specimens that possess many of the typical traits and are more obviously part of the group, and those that share fewer traits and are more on the fringes. One of the challenges of artificial intelligence is to teach a machine, whose mind is based on a binary logic of zeros and ones, to learn to identify two different items by the same word. But our human minds are not binary in that way. We are flexible by nature, and can perceive them all as belonging to the same group. So the terminology for biological sex might be binary, but our interpretation of it isn't. We recognize only male and female, but we perceive each of these terms as containing a wide variety of specimens. To convince me that there are more than two biological sexes, you will have to show me a human specimen whose organs actually have a different sexual function from the functions of the male and female organs. But all the examples I saw are just what is called intersex people. People who possess both male and female anatomical components. That does not justify the constitution of a third sex. They can be fit into one of the two existing sexes, using the principle of family resemblance, and there's no need to relegate them to a status of a different kind of human. So, you failed to convince me that there's such a thing as non-binary biological sex. Let's move on to the second concept, gender identity. Now this one is actually the one that causes most of the controversy, because when it comes to biological sex, we all agree that it exists and we all agree that it is something you are born with. And when it comes to gender expressions, we all agree that they exist and we all agree that they are, or at least mostly are, a social construct. But where does gender identity come from?
Gender identity is the way that you identify up here in your head.
So it is a psychological thing, something that exists inside your head. The claim here is that your mind has a self-perception of gender identity, which is usually compatible with the gender that you were assigned at birth based on your biological sex. But sometimes there is a mismatch, and the way you perceive yourself is different from your assigned gender. That creates gender dysphoria, a sense of alienation and discontent with your assigned gender identity. Who you are inside your head is not what society perceives you to be, so it is as if you are trapped inside an identity that isn't really yours. That makes sense to me. It makes sense that along with your biological sex, nature also creates a psychological image in your mind of which sex you are. And it's also probable that every once in a while, as nature does, nature gets its wires crossed, and creates individuals who are given a female body but an image of a male body in their mind, or vice versa. So their own gender identity does not match the gender identity that society assigned to them at birth. I can definitely see how this can cause alienation and misery. This gender dysphoria is the condition that characterizes transgender people, and Western society has come to accept them. But the term transgender has been immensely expanded in recent years, to include non-binary people as well. From Ashley's videos I've learned that some people distinguish between these two terms, and for the sake of this video I'm going to do the same. So I'm going to use transgender for people who feel that the gender identity is that of the opposite gender to the one they were assigned at birth, the one based on their biological sex. Non-binary, on the other hand, are people who believe that their gender identity doesn't fall in the domain of either of the two traditional genders, and that it constitutes a different gender. Those are the people who are causing the controversy, so those are the people we are going to focus on. Can you convince me that there are more than two genders?
The gender binary refers to there being only two genders, man or woman, in society. The gender binary is a social construct that essentially limits the roles that men and women can play in society. It predisposes them to certain stereotypes and to certain types of roles that they should be playing in their day-to-day lives. In reality, there are infinite genders.
So, this is the claim. In reality, there are infinite genders, but society has constructed a world that recognizes only two genders. So the question becomes, what do you mean by in reality? You are saying here that gender itself is not a social construct, only the gender binary is. Gender identity, according to you, is something that comes from nature. Nature creates multiple gender identities. Can you substantiate that claim?
For me personally, the gender binary enforced a lot of stereotypes on me when I was coming out as transgender and transitioning to be a man. I felt a pressure, a societal pressure to fit into a certain stereotype or box.
So your gender expressions did not fit into the gender binary. In the past, that was indeed a problem. Western society did indeed have a rigid perception of the gender binary, and certain behaviors that were seen as belonging to the gender expression of the opposite gender could have got you into trouble. Nowadays, however, we perceive gender in a more flexible way, according to the principle of family resemblance. You are expected to behave in the way that is typical to your gender, but you are allowed to behave differently. If your behavior puts you on the margins of the typical gender expressions, you will indeed feel some social pressure to conform, but that's true with any type of eccentric behavior. And in any case, that does not prove that you are of a different gender by nature. It only shows that your nature puts you on the margins of the known genders. I've watched quite a few videos and read quite a few articles by non-binary people, and could not find a shred of evidence that there is such a thing in nature as a third gender identity. As a matter of fact, I don't see how it is even possible to provide such evidence. As we've established before, there are only two biological sexes, so you can't rely on biology to make that claim. So if it's not biology, what's left? What is left is a social construct. And this is where your entire argument collapses. You say that in reality there are infinite genders, and you contrast that reality with the gender binary, which you say is a social construct. But the reality you speak of is in itself merely a social construct, which you have created. Your mind was not born with the label of a different gender identity. You happen to have a mind that enjoys expressions that are different from what is typical to your gender, and instead of accepting that you are simply on the fringes of that gender, you have constructed new genders and labeled yourselves by them. The question is, what gives you the right to do so?
And it's important to note that gender is a super personal thing, so the way that these labels are defined can vary from person to person and identity to identity.
No, it is not a personal thing. Labels are part of language. Language, once again, is a public thing. You can't just use it any way you want. You can't just define yourself as a different gender and demand of all of us to call you as such, any more that I can define myself as a Queen of England and demand that you call me Your Majesty.
The pronouns that a trans person asks others to use in reference to them are sometimes called preferred pronouns. However, this label is kind of misleading because trans people's pronouns are not just preferred, they are correct.
No, Kratilus. Labels are not part of your nature. Labels are arbitrary signs, and they are based on agreement. Until we agree with you on the meaning of a certain label, you cannot use it in conversation with us, or demand that we use it. You guys claim to represent reality, against the paradigm of the gender binary that is merely a social construct. We find now that it is the other way around. The two established genders are indeed a social construct, but they are based in reality, in the two biological sexes. Your non-binary genders, on the other hand, have no connection to reality. They are completely a social construct, something that you have invented. You have latched on to the essentially true notion that biological sex, gender identity, and gender expression are different and separate things, but you have taken it too far. It is true that they are separate, but they are also connected to each other, and more importantly, they obey the laws of nature and language. You, however, seem to think that you are free to do whatever you want with them. I mean, look at this guy.
In my case, for example, I was assigned male at birth, but I choose to identify as female. She and her is my pronouns and everything else that comes with it, but I continue to present in a masculine way. Everything from my clothes to my voice, my beard, except maybe for my nails, are traditionally masculine. And that's fine, but it's something that I think a lot of people at this point still don't understand.
You're right, I don't understand it. Can you run that by me again?
I was assigned male at birth, but I choose to identify as female.
Did I just hear you say choose?
But I choose to identify as female.
Yeah, I believe you just exposed yourself. As those of us who are serious about our identities know, you do not choose an identity. The identity chooses you. It is based on an experience or an interest that you have, that is so deep that it becomes part of your being. Bronies did not choose to like the show My Little Pony. They watched it and fell in love with it, and the ridicule that they encountered drove them to seek each other out and form a group identity. Now, if I choose to call myself a brony, even though I do not feel this way about the show, will they accept me? No, they will see me as a poser. You, sir, strike me as a poser, as do some other non-binary people I've encountered. The problem is, since a non-binary rationality states that gender is a self-identified thing, they have no way of calling out these posers. I don't want to make it seem like this guy represents all non-binary people. With others, I believe them that they experience real dysphoria. However, none of them convince me that their dysphoria is the result of having a different nature. It seems to be simply the result of mischaracterizing Western society. You call yourselves non-binary, but you are actually a lot more rigidly binary than the rest of us. While Western society is flexible in its understanding of gender, and is willing to accept that males and females can express themselves in various ways, you seem to have a binary perception of the two genders, and that's why you can't find yourselves in it. You claim that there is scientific evidence for the existence of non-binary people, but what you allude to is simply evidence that people like you exist, people who enjoy expressing themselves in ways that are more androgynous. What you are doing has nothing to do with science. It is all about language. You choose to label yourselves as a different gender, instead of non-characteristic members of one of the two genders. And if we accept your way of thinking, then, like I argued about sexual identities, we will give hand to the partitioning of our society, with all the negative effects this may entail. Sorry, but I refuse to take part in this. When confronted with these points, the non-binaries often retort by arguing that cis people cannot know what their experience is, so we can't tell them that they are wrong. That is true to an extent. It is true that I cannot fully understand your subjective experience, although as a fellow human I can relate to it through similar experiences of my own. However, you guys are not just making subjective claims. You are making objective statements about nature, about society and about language, and expecting us to accept those statements as true. When you do that, you can't rely on your subjective feelings. You have to appeal to an objective criterion of truth. You have to substantiate your claims using reason and observable facts. Another claim that they often make is that they don't understand what the big deal is, and why we can't just let them be what they want to be.
If people want to fucking call themselves tri-gender, let them call themselves tri-gender. It literally affects none of us.
And it doesn't hurt you or inconvenience you in any way to respect someone else's self-identification.
If I want to call myself non-binary, or if you want to call yourself gender neutral, or you want to call yourself gray gender, like it's not...
Yeah, it doesn't matter to you, so like, it doesn't impact your life in any way. And if the biggest thing that somebody is asking for is for you to use a different word, then I don't really see the problem, because that is such a simple request.
Right. What's the big deal? One would think that you are trying to fundamentally change the rationality of our society, in a way that will force us to change every document and every other gender-based institute. One would think that you are trying to perform a hostile takeover of our language, and attempt to destroy its logic and reshape it. One would think that you are trying to partition us, to endlessly divide us over things that should not be divisive. One would think that because of guys like this calling themselves women and demanding to use ladies' bathrooms, there might be a backlash that will force women like this to use men's bathrooms. Really, what's the big deal? There was once a writer and logician named Lewis Carroll. Don't get excited, despite the name he was not a bigender. And he wrote a book about a place called Wonderland, a place filled with weird creatures that have a logic of their own. Watching your videos, Ashley, I felt a little bit like Alice, trying to figure out a logic that is not the logic of my world. You guys are all really cute, and I love how unique you are trying to be. But your rationality is alien to the rationality that Western society is based on, that any society is based on, that any society can be based on. We cannot allow your rationality to invade our world, because it will destroy it. Look, all of this would be fine if you made it a cultural identity. There have been gender-bending subcultures in the past, such as the glam subculture, but glam also contained other elements. If you want to create a non-binary subculture, where you will live in your own wonderland and call each other whatever you want, I will defend your right to do so, and so will many others. And in time, you can find a way to integrate into mainstream culture, in a way that will give you some recognition while not destroying our society's rationality. I don't have any problem recognizing other genders on the cultural level, and keeping the two-gender dichotomy to the official level. But that is not what you're doing, is it? You are claiming to represent truth against the illusion of the gender binary world. You are demanding of all of us to accept your rationality and make it part of our official world, so it becomes our rationality as well. For instance, you demand that we learn and use your pronouns.
There are many types of gender-neutral pronouns, such as Z or Zir.
That is so cool!
That is cool! That means that I get to come over as tolerant and progressive, while sounding like a badly acted Nazi. Z is not a Fräulein.
You need to respect people's pronouns. Do not question them, just embrace them.
Sprechen Sie. Dummkopf. So let me get this straight. Or cis. Let's say I define myself as opportunigender, which means someone who shifts genders according to convenience. I claim that this is how I feel inside, so no one has the right to deny my identity. Then I identify as a woman whenever it privileges me, for instance, when I apply to a university. And at other times, when it privileges me, I identify as a man. What do you think of that?
That is so cool!
Yeah, I'm sure you'll think that's cool, Ashley. But most of us would say that society cannot function in that way. And if we allow your rationality to prevail, I see absolutely nothing to prevent people from defining themselves as opportunigenders and exploiting it. So I'm sorry, but this is where I draw the line. You guys are welcome to use your rationality in your own little world, but we cannot allow it into ours. The problem is, it has penetrated our world, and infiltrated some high places, like the academy, the media, and even the government. And now there's a push to enforce this rationality on all of us. It is now politically incorrect to deny your identities, and anyone who does so might pay the social price. And now, on top of that, there's an attempt at legislation that will penalize anyone who does it.
In New York City, they have identified 31 gender identities, and apparently the law down there suggests that if businesses don't accommodate an individual's chosen gender identity, there is the risk of a six-figure fine.
This clip is taken from a recent debate on Canadian TV, which transpired after Jordan Peterson, a professor of psychology in the University of Toronto, published a series of YouTube videos in which he criticized an attempt to bring similar legalization to Canada. Identifying the danger unfolded in this development, Peterson announced that he refuses to play along and acknowledge non-binary identities and pronouns. The videos went viral, as did the video of Peterson being subsequently accosted by a group of students who display the same egocentric and entitled attitude we've witnessed throughout this video.
Why do you have the authority to determine whether or not an individual is worthy of you using their pronouns? Like if I asked you, would you please use they them pronouns for me? What?
It would depend on what I thought of your motivation. What hoops do you want us to jump through?
Those are my pronouns.
To be clear, Professor Peterson doesn't have a problem with trans identities, only with non-binary identities. We know because our own sweet transsexual, and I do mean sexual, Theron Meyer is on the show, and he has no problem acknowledging her.
Okay, let me find out then. Let me find out. If she were a student of yours, what would you call her?
She.
You would.
Also on the show is Nicholas Matt, a lecturer in transgender studies, and here is his opening statement.
Basically, it's not correct that there is such a thing as biological sex, and I'm a historian of medicine. I can unpack that for you at great length if you want, but in the interest of time, I won't.
You won't because you can't. Your theories have nothing to do with science. They are just language games. You and your colleagues are classifying people by categories of gender and claiming that they have a different nature from each other, in the same way that 19th century scientists classified homosexuals as having a different nature from heterosexuals, instead of just seeing them as variants of the same sexuality. You are partitioning our society, and what's worse, you are poisoning the minds of your students. Instead of teaching them that we are all a little different but still belong to the same two genders, you are generating gender dysphoria in their minds, making them think that they have a different nature that is unrecognized in our society. You are taking human minds that have the capability to be flexible and teaching them to think only in zeros and ones. Instead of trying to open and expand their minds and help them become happy people, you are diminishing their minds and making them miserable. I've been asking Ashley and her friends what makes them think that they have the right to abuse language the way they do. I realize now that I shouldn't have been asking what, but who. It is gender studies scholars like Nicholas Matt who have twisted their mind in such a way, making them perceive themselves as a separate class of people, an oppressed class. It is gender studies scholars who made them think that they have the right to own their labels, and viciously attack people who refuse to cater to their egocentricity. And it is the gender studies scholars, along with their friends in the radical left, who are pushing oppressive laws and attitudes.
Nick, can I be clear on something? You've accused him of abusing students by not using the pronouns they want to be addressed by.
That's how I see it, absolutely.
That is tantamount to abuse in your view?
Absolutely. Many global documents, many
How
organizations.
about violence? Is it tantamount to violence?
Yes,
How about
absolutely.
hate speech? Is it tantamount to hate speech?
Yes, of course. It's hate speech
Fine,
to tell
that's-
someone that you won't refer to them as in a way that they that recognizes their humanity and dignity.
Off with his hands!
And that's the game. Divide and conquer. Once they've created this artificial class of allegedly oppressed people, they can then pretend to be its defenders and use it to silence people who disagree with the radical left politics. And they won't stop until they have us all indoctrinated. But hey, look on the bright side. If they succeed, we all get to talk like badly acted Nazis.
Is they're all indoctrinated? No! Is they're all good little Nazis? No! Is they're all good little adults? No! Then we will all salute Bell Robert Schultz about face! The Geil! The Geil! The Geil! The Geil! The Geil!
If that's the way they want to play, then I am making this a thing. You, my viewers, are welcome to use it. Define yourself as any gender that suits you at the moment, and make the authorities have to deal with it. And if anyone challenges you on it, accuse them of not recognizing your humanity and dignity, and denying your legally defended rights. That way, we will force the authorities to do one of two things. Either defend the logic behind the legislation, or get rid of it. And if any of you so-called non-binary people thinks that I got it wrong, I'll be happy to be corrected. But you'd better be respectful. Remember that I am opportune gender, which means that I can be any one of the genders that you are, so you can't tell me that I don't understand what you are going through. You, on the other hand, are not opportune genders, so you have no way of knowing about my world. In short, I am more oppressed than you. My pronoun, by the way, is my master, and this is how I want you to address me, or I will accuse you of not recognizing my humanity and dignity. If you do not comply with those demands, I will switch to my transgender identity and accuse you of being transphobic, and then you will be guilty of hate speech.